Good afternoon. This is Michele Shuster. Welcome to the McMurray and Schuster Stir Shaken and What It Means for You webinar. We have a pretty large group that signed up for the webinar today, so I don't think we'll have time with this half-an-hour presentation to get to all of the questions, but please do present or send us through the chat section your questions. We'll respond to you individually, and we'll also post responses on our mnslawgroup.com TCPA blog. So today, your presenters are Josh Stevens and myself. I am a founding partner at McMurray and Schuster. I'm also a former consumer protection chief from the Ohio Attorney General's office and current general counsel for PACE, the Professional Association for Customer Engagements. Also speaking with me, as I mentioned, is Josh Stevens. If you'd like to give yourself an introduction, Josh.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Stevens. I'm a senior attorney in our compliance department, where I focus on privacy, marketing, advertising, and teleservices issues.
So a quick disclaimer, these webinars are always for informational purposes only and are not legal advice. We always recommend that you consult with your own attorney with regard to any legal questions. And by providing this webinar, we're not developing an attorney-client relationship. So with that, let's go over the agenda. We want to quickly talk about what Stir Shaken is and probably answer the most important question that we're hearing right now. What can you do as a call originator or a call center or a vendor that is assisting call originators to ensure that calls get the level of attestation that they need to arrive at the called recipient? We're going to provide a timeline of when Stir Shaken will be introduced and rolled out through all of the carriers. We're also going to talk about some of the benefits and limitations to Stir Shaken, and then let you know what you can do now to prepare to fully implement Stir Shaken. So with that, Josh, let's get started. What is Stir Shaken?
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Michele. And those of you on today's call, I'm sure many of you have heard what Stir Shaken is repeatedly over time, but I wanted to level set and make sure we're all working off the same base of knowledge. Essentially, Stir Shaken is a call authentication framework that works on IP-based networks. It's a standard that works for telephony systems that are based on internet protocol. And at a high level, how it works is the originating carrier, so the voice service provider that's putting your call onto the telephone network, will sign that call with some level of an attestation rating. And we're going to talk about those attestation ratings here in just a moment. It does this through an encrypted code that's built into the SIP header. That call proceeds then through the network and eventually arrives at the terminating carrier for the called party. That terminating carrier is then able to decrypt that encoded signature and verify it. Then it'll use that data to decide what to do with the call. So we are all familiar with the call blocking and tagging analytics programs that exist. And all the major carriers now are using one of these programs. Many carriers may also have some proprietary models that they use, but essentially the Stir Shaken data element, that attestation rating, helps that carrier with their analytics algorithm determine, should I put this call through to the person? Should I put this call through with some sort of label that it's verified or it's not verified? Should I send it to voicemail? Should I not let it through at all? Should I block it? And we're going to talk about the interplay of Stir Shaken and these analytics programs in a moment. But the key thing for the callers who are relying on Stir Shaken is making sure you're getting the right attestation rating for your call and the highest level attestation rating. So there are 3 levels. The first is A level, or a full attestation. What this means is that the carrier has confidence in your identity as the caller and your right to use the caller ID information that you're presenting with the call. The B-level attestation, a partial attestation, means that the carrier has confidence in your identity, but not necessarily your right to use that caller ID. So for example, if you are a contact center with multiple clients on whose behalf you're calling, you could run into a situation where your carrier knows who you are, and they know that this traffic is originating from you, but they don't know that this caller ID value that probably belongs to your client, say it's to their customer service center, so that if someone calls the number back, it routes to that customer service center. They don't know that you have the authorization to use that number. So you might not get that A-level rating. And then the lowest level rating is a C-level or gateway attestation. And essentially what this means is that the carrier is certifying that they were the one who put the call on the network, but they're not confident in or validating the identity of the caller, or that caller has the right to use that caller ID value. And this can come up in a number of different ways. Obviously, the one that this was designed for was a situation where you have illegal callers, people trying to hide their identities, and so those calls get labeled potentially as a C. But in other respects, it can happen with calls that originate on a non-IP network, potentially. So those may come in and get labeled with a gateway attestation when they hit an IP-based network, or maybe they don't get signed at all. Can also happen with, we're hearing that potentially calls coming in internationally, when those hit the United States, they may get a gateway attestation from the carrier that allows them onto the telephony network here in the US, but they're not going to get A or B because that gateway node can't verify the identity. And this is all being tested, it's being worked through. And Michele, tell us, how is this rolling out?
So StirShaken began its deployments back in 2019, and at this point in time, all of the major carriers have deployed a system that allows them to issue certificates and have those to function within their inner network. So if you have one of the major carriers, you're likely already experiencing for those inner network calls StirShaken. On March 31, 2020, the FCC released a notice of further proposed rulemaking, and it has to do with originating and terminating carriers and how they must deploy StirShaken. One of the critical issues that's still being addressed and will be addressed by that proposed rulemaking is what's the role of the intermediary carriers, those carriers between the call originators and the call terminators. And so that's something that Josh is going to talk about here in a few moments, but this is an area where we're still not certain exactly how it's going to be handled, but there's several proposals that are being circulated out there. And then finally, on June 30th, 2020, pursuant to the Traced Act, all carriers are to have implemented the StirShaken protocols and have their network up and running. The smaller rural carriers that primarily have TDM or copper line are going to be given the ability to get an extension of time for deploying StirShaken, but we should see the overwhelming majority of the carriers at least close to fully implementing StirShaken by June 30th, 2021. So it's critical between now and then, and as StirShaken gets deployed, that you understand those steps that you need to take to ensure that you do get that highest level of attestation that Josh mentioned.
Yeah, and as this is rolling out, one of the things that I do want to make sure we all understand is that StirShaken is not call blocking. So as I mentioned earlier, the major carriers are using analytics partners to analyze call traffic, and StirShaken is going to be an input into those algorithms. And so think about it this way. The algorithm will take into account hundreds of variables, that are associated with that call, that caller, or the caller ID value. Things like complaints, calling patterns, call durations, and yes, the STIR/SHAKEN input. And we believe that A-rated calls are likely to be treated favorably in these blocking algorithms. B and C calls might be treated with more suspicion. Because these algorithms are proprietary, we don't have insight to know for certain that that's how this is going to happen, but it seems likely just based on what we're hearing out in the ecosystem. And one of the other things to think about, and Michele, this goes to what you were just mentioning with the smaller and rural carriers, is that the weight that these algorithms put on the STIR/SHAKEN values is likely to increase over time as deployment continues and the smaller rural carriers are starting to get it deployed. The major carriers have more confidence that the system is working, right? We want to make sure that if those values are going into the algorithms, that they're given the right weight, and that weight is probably going to increase over time. Now, there are some benefits and limitations to STIR/SHAKEN. The first is it does not indicate whether a call is legal or illegal, or if that call is wanted or unwanted. It's only providing that attestation rating of A, B, or C based on the confidence in the caller's identity and the right to use that caller ID value. We see a lot of confusion, even amongst really sophisticated parties when they're filing comments with the FCC, where they try to make an argument that STIR/SHAKEN determines the legality or illegality of a call. It does not. It's just an input into those analytics software, which they might put high weight on, but it's not going to tell you whether a call is legal or illegal. One of the things it does, though, is it does help facilitate traceback. It allows the law enforcement agencies, the US Telecom Industry Traceback Group, and others to be able to identify those callers. So if illegal calls are being made, they can root those out and delineate between those and the legal callers. It is only for IP-based networks and equipment, so TDM equipment is not going to be covered. That is going to be a challenge for rural areas. The FCC acknowledged this in their further notice of proposed rulemaking, that the smaller rural carriers are going to have a challenge. But at this point, I think it's safe to say the vast majority of calls that are being made by large contact centers or enterprises are using IP-based networks. So it's going to be more the fringe case that that's going to be an issue. And then I mentioned before this issue of the B rating when there's a mismatch between the caller and the caller ID value that's being displayed. This is sometimes referred to as the enterprise problem and arises in a couple contexts. The first being what I described, where you are a contact center using the caller ID values of your client, so your carrier doesn't know that you have authorization to use those. Another area where it comes up is with least cost routing or failover systems, or when you're using caller ID values that you obtain from one carrier, but you're using a different carrier to originate those calls, right? So you're getting that caller ID value from carrier A. Carrier A knows who you are. Carrier A knows you have the right to use that number because they assigned it to you. So you could get an A-level attestation there. But then you take that caller ID value you obtained from carrier A, and now you're placing a call using carrier B. Carrier B knows who you are, but carrier B does not know that you're authorized to use that number, so they're likely to give a B-level rating. And this enterprise problem is being worked through. There are a number of solutions that are being considered, and each kind of has its pros and cons. We're looking at models such as delegated certificates, where carriers could delegate some signing authority to the caller, but it's still under a carrier's purview. Some are advocating for a solution that allows enterprises to directly sign calls, but this is an issue that is on Addis's radar and it is being worked through. As a caller, and this I think is probably the part of the presentation most of you were most wanting to get to here, what can you do right now to work towards having your calls get the best ratings, making sure they're signed, and that your calls are hopefully getting through to the called party? Well, the first is you have to know what you're working with. So inventory your telephone numbers. Make sure you know who the providing carrier is, right? Who that number is assigned to, what caller ID values are you using. I give clients these recommendations for privacy projects all the time, that you also have to, for a privacy project, you got to know what data you have that you're trying to protect. When you're working in StirShaken to make sure you're ready, you got to know what telephone numbers you're using, what carriers they're from, and how those are interplaying in your system, right? Or do you have failover systems? Do you use least cost routing? And how is all of that working? The second thing is to ready your equipment. Make sure that your equipment is ready to provide the information to the carriers that they need to sign those calls. One of the questions that, or one of the issues rather, that we've heard is that some of the PBXs that are out there can sometimes strip information before the call goes out. So you need to work with your engineering teams to make sure that isn't happening. And Michele, we were talking earlier about the test bed. Do you want to mention the Neustar test bed environment?
Sure. So Neustar has worked with Addis to put together a test environment. They call it the robocall test center, but it allows call originators, their vendors, other folks that are assisting with generating calls, and have an OCN. There's a requirement that you have an OCN. Then you will be allowed to use the test center, and you'll be able to determine based on the inputs that you have, the telephone numbers, how your carriers are viewing those, how your calls will go through the network. So to the extent you fall into that category and you have an OCN, I would encourage you to reach out to Neustar about working within that robocall test environment.
Yeah, and obviously you don't want to wait till June 30th of 2021 to know whether your equipment's going to work or not, right? So the earlier the better to get working on these issues. And that also goes along with item number 3 here on the list, which is contacting your carriers. Find out how their implementation is progressing, what they're going to require to get that A rating, and really working hand in glove with them to make sure you're prepared to get them what they need. And I will say, if their implementation is going a little slow, maybe push them a little bit to make that implementation work, because what would be great for you if you're a caller and you can get that A rating is to have some sort of verified check mark, right, that appears when your call comes through, so that the consumer knows, hey, this call's been verified, it's been validated, it's safe for me to answer this call. And that will improve your contact rates, I'm sure. That's just common sense. So work with your carriers to make sure that's going to happen. You can take advantage of it. Another thing you can do is validate your calling numbers using one of these services that have been developed specifically to help companies that work with multiple carriers, or companies who are doing large volume calling, where those calls could end up hitting multiple carriers' networks. And so some of these services work by essentially validating who you are and your right to use these numbers, and then feeding that information to the carriers and their analytics partners. Some of these services really operate more like a consultant to help you sort of clean up your data, clean up the numbers you're using to improve your chances, but they're not necessarily feeding information to anyone. But there are multiple of these services out there, and you might look into using one of them. Another option is you might think about using a carrier or some sort of enterprise solution that has signing authority and will sign your calls with an A-level rating. We've heard that there are some companies out there who have OCNs, have access to numbering resources, have gotten certificates to be able to sign, and who can act as that first level carrier and then route your calls to the other carriers, but they're getting signed at that first point by that company. So you might look for those types of services as well. And then, the FCC is taking in input from the public and from industry on how STIR/SHAKEN is getting deployed and whether the FCC needs to get involved or just leave it to the governance authority, the STIGA, which is a group of carriers that have been tasked with overseeing STIR/SHAKEN. And if you're seeing that the solutions that are out there right now aren't fitting your needs, so say you're an enterprise that you think you really need to have the ability to sign calls on your own. You think that you should be able to get the certificates that allow you to do that, and that shouldn't be something that's reserved just for carriers. Make your voice heard. File comments in response to the further notice of proposed rulemaking. I think we are now past the comment and reply comment deadline, but I'm sure there will be other opportunities as well. You can also reach out to the STIGA or members of the STIGA to express your concerns for what you would like to see happen. This is a new technology, it is a new standard, and it's going to take everyone participating and pointing out the issues that they're running into to make this develop and be the best that it really can be. And, Michele, I think the overarching thing here, and I'd love to, get your thought on this, is that as a caller, the end goal here is to make sure that you're getting those best labeling, if there are labels attached, that they're the right labels and they're good labels, that your calls aren't getting blocked, and that the route that's probably going to help the most to make that happen is getting that A-level attestation, but still understanding that that's not going to be the only thing you have to do. So don't lose sight of the other techniques that we've talked about in prior webinars for making sure that you're calling in good patterns, you're not looking like a spammer, because the A-level rating isn't going to be the be all end all.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make, Josh. I think I probably have heard the most surprise when talking about STIR/SHAKEN that a company could get an A-level attestation, meaning we know who you are and we know that you have the right to use this telephone number, but you still could get tagged or labeled or blocked by one of the carrier's analytics companies. So really critical not to lose sight of having calling patterns that that aren't going to trigger that labeling or that blocking. And one of the questions we got in advance of this webinar was, how do you recommend companies monitor their list to ensure that their legitimate phone calls do not get blocked? And Josh has already mentioned one way. There are vendors out there, some of the folks that we and some of our clients have worked with, like Quality Voice and Data or Numerical or other vendors like that. There's several of them out there. They can assist to monitor your lists and to see how your phone numbers and how your calls are being treated as they go through the various carriers. Also, I always think it's a really good idea for a lot of different reasons, not just for STIR/SHAKEN, but also for compliance purposes, that you seed your lists so that folks within your organization will get phone calls that will be able to see what type of either labeling or any other type of blocking, meaning they wouldn't have gotten the call when you know that that call was originated from your facility, but so that they can monitor to see how those calls are coming out on the other side. As I said, I think for compliance, it's also a good idea, because if those calls do get through, then it gives you the ability to hear what your customers are hearing as the calls are received. Plus, you know, the analytics companies, or the analytics partners, as Josh has called them, with the carriers, they do have various mechanisms, websites, contacts that will help you register your telephone numbers with analytics companies. And I will tell you that's a little bit of a controversial point, whether you want to provide all of your numbers to analytics companies. I've heard some concerns about that, but nonetheless, there is the ability to do that with the analytics companies, and that will help to ensure that your calls are not getting wrongfully labeled or blocked. So that's really it's an excellent question. Josh, I think we have some more questions that have come in advance of the webinar. Do we want to go ahead and
we
take
did,
those?
and I think we've got time. Yeah, I think we've got time to get through the ones we received in advance. So another question that we received was, how does STIR/SHAKEN affect call centers that are using legacy equipment where there's no SIP header information that is being sent? And as mentioned at the top of the presentation, STIR/SHAKEN works on IP-based networks only, so it only works with SIP. If there is no SIP header information sent, then based on my understanding of how this is going to work, it's likely not going to be signed, or it'll get signed and a SIP header attached with a gateway rating. So it's going to end up with that lowest level rating, which we want to avoid. So if you're still using legacy equipment, you might think about maybe it's time for an upgrade, and you know, deploying that to make sure you're getting the ratings that you want.
Josh, kind of along those same lines, I get a lot of questions about international calls. So international calls coming through the international gateway. What are your thoughts on that? What have you been hearing?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is they're working on a solution for that, fingers crossed. It's looking like at present and for the early stages, those calls are likely going to get a C level that's going to be attached by the carrier at that gateway node onto the US network. But ATIS is trying to find solutions for international calls. Unfortunately, a lot of that is going to come down to what cooperation can the United States get from other countries. There's obviously a really good relationship with Canada, but we know that there are certain countries that are prolific in making spam calls, and getting cooperation from them might be a little more challenging.
Yeah, and I think that emphasizes again the point that you made about it's not just STIR/SHAKEN that you have to worry about. It's all of those other you know, types of controls that you can have over your calls with working with vendors, and call patterns and those types of things will be even more critically important also in that international call setting. We've gotten a question about live agent outbound calls that are using local area codes and whether that's allowed. You know, they set the question up that it would most definitely be a lawful call, and that they were lawfully using local caller IDs. And so on a federal level, the truth in caller ID controls. And on the federal level, in the situation that was presented here, there would be no violation or no prohibition against using those local caller IDs, provided there was no intent to defraud, cause harm, or wrongfully obtain something of value, which is how the Truth in Caller ID Act defines a violation. But you should know that on a state level, there are several states that have regulations that are more restrictive than the Truth in Caller ID Act, those being California, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and West Virginia. So be aware and work with your attorney to make sure that you're meeting the legal requirements of those state regulations. And I will tell you, there is a case out there that says that the Truth in Caller ID Act preempts this area, but it has not, I think, been strenuously challenged. So I really encourage folks to make sure that they're complying with these state regulations. Josh, I think we might have time. Go ahead.
Yeah, Michelle, I'm going to just correct one thing. I think you misspoke. It's not California, it's Kentucky.
Oh, I'm sorry,
So
Kentucky.
Both
That's because Josh is from Kentucky, so I think there was an intentional block there, Josh. But anyway, I think we have time for one more question. If you can take the last.
Yeah, so we got a couple questions about using local caller IDs or rotating large numbers of caller IDs to avoid spam likely designations. And what I will say is, if those caller IDs have been assigned to you, you own them, they can ring back, and a consumer can make a do not call request. From a legal perspective, I don't see too much concern with that. Where we have seen some people get in trouble is they use a service that rotates large numbers of caller IDs for them or localizes caller ID. They get assigned that number for a day or half a day, and then that number is no longer theirs. The person cannot call back to make a do not call request, or the number is never actually even properly assigned to them. It just gets attached. Those start creating quite a bit more risk. So you want to understand, if you're going to use a service that does localization or rotates you through large numbers of caller ID values, you want to make sure you really understand how that service works, because you could potentially face some liability on the back end there.
That's a great setup for what we should do for a future webinar, Josh. So US Telecom, which is the trade association for the carriers, pursuant to authorization in the Traced Act, which was passed earlier this year and implemented into law, that they've put together what's known as the Traceback Group, and their purpose is to be able to trace back to the call originator calls that are difficult currently to trace back, because there is no STIR/SHAKEN network that follows the call from call originator to termination. And so this Traceback Group is issuing requests for information. Companies are being required to answer those. Situations like Josh just mentioned are areas where the Traceback Group has been prolific, but other companies as well. So Josh, I think we should come back and do a future webinar on that topic. What do you think?
I think that's a brilliant idea.
Okay, let's do it. We'll do it. All right, so we have exceeded our time by a few minutes here. We're going to wrap it up now. Please don't hesitate to submit questions to Josh and I through the webinar platform. We will answer those questions directly to you, and then we will be putting together some Q&As on our mslawgroup.com TCPA blog that will pull all of those questions together with answers. So thank you for your time and attention today. We appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of the day.